people here have gracile teeth. I have gracile ribs and gracile features somewhat, and I have Neanderthal teeth. The Neanderthal teeth are a little more squarer. The Neanderthals were no longer using their teeth to the same degree as the gracile China people were. The China people grew a tooth which became quite shovel-shaped tooth, and this was for, they were preparing spears with their teeth and doing all kinds of work actually with their teeth. So when the seas subsided, of course, whilst living in the sea, there was an environment where great change occurs. Usually when some shift happens, there's also usually a great shift in intelligence of the species. So the auditory system becomes much more important to us living in a water environment, as it is for those mammals that have shifted back into the water environment. Sound becomes quite important in the communication process. And the visual system a little less, and olfaction certainly less. So living in an aquatic environment enabled us to be free of gravity. This is very important because all knuckle-walking animals have quite a bit of electrical activity running down the back of their body, more or less to hold their head in an upright position, so it's tonically flexed. And if you can imagine that I put 20 pounds of weight in your hand, right, and I came over and added 3 ounces, probably you would not know that I'd added 3 ounces. Then I'm talking about the just noticeable difference that enabled us to be able to pick through fine tactile, kinesthetic and visceral programs that were coming through our body that enabled us to make use much more of our whole self in our state of consciousness. If there was only 5 ounces and I came over and added a couple of ounces, you would know that I'd added a couple of ounces to your hand. And this is to do with a just noticeable difference. The amount of electrical activity that was there holding the 20 pounds, there was so much electrical activity there that it was unable to notice that minute difference. So when we were living in an aquatic environment, we were able to pick out fine tactile, kinesthetic and visceral programs that were coming through the body because we were free of gravity. The only way that we could be free of gravity once the sea subsided was to be walking in an upright position like this, so that the head is perfectly balanced, enabling fine tactile, kinesthetic and visceral programs to be coming through the body. So floating is a wonderful thing. Floating releases endogenous opiates in the brain. That's a major thing that it does. In working with people who are drug addicted in New York and other places, I've really had quite a bit of success working with people who have been addicted to heroin and things like that. And one of the things that I'm doing is, as I realise that most of these people really have very little of their own in natural body opiates. This whole system has been overwhelmed, and because of the opiates the person has put into their system themselves, their own opiate system has closed down somewhat. So when this person would go off the substance that they've been on, the simplest things that they would ordinarily be doing, that getting some satisfaction from, their body is not giving them the same degree of satisfaction, and so they are feeling quite catastrophic often. So there's a need to be able to provide something which majorly affects this person's endogenous opiates, to stimulate endogenous opiates to be there. So that's one of the things that I'm quite concerned about in helping guide someone through this time, and that's giving them something that will replace the habit that they've had, which will cost practically the same, which will be using pretty much the same time as that was before, which is giving them quite an intense amount of their own natural body opiates. So flotation tank is something that I use quite a bit with people like that. There are other things too that work. Certainly I think floating is one of the greatest ways to build these endogenous opiates. And more or less the fix of going into a tank is much the same probably as what a heroin fix might have been for the person. So it's substituting one thing for the other. That's very important that we're able to build up those endogenous opiates in the person, because then when they're doing the simplest things, they're really getting some satisfaction from it.
The people that I've known that were doing heroin, when they actually did it, at the time that they did it for the next couple of hours, their behavior didn't seem a lot different to me. Maybe they were experiencing some type of euphoria or bliss,
yes.
But they always seem to be still lethargic. Like maybe they're experiencing something neurological. I don't know.
Yes, the main thing is that people who have coping strategies, varying coping strategies. Some people, their coping strategies involve satiation. Mostly these things happen, from childhood, that we learn how we learn to cope. Some people learn to cope through satiation. Someone who is involving satiation of themselves as a coping strategy will be the kind of person who may choose heroin as a way to bring this, or someone who eats food with sucking reflex and satiation. Now, somebody else may do it through arousal. So then this person's going to stimulants more, or jumping out of airplanes, or doing other things like that. So that's actually right. So that's stimulant.
Diminishing the self?
Satiation is like when your body's feeling like satiated, completely like filled, sort of. Saturated, filled, kind of. Okay. So we have satiation, we have arousal, and we have fantasy. So another way that people cope with the world is through fantasy. And so this person, as a recreational drug, they may choose, LSD or something like that. So those three ways are major ways that people kind of are coping, and generally lead to habits that the person has in their way of coping.
David, is the saturation, would that be along the lines of sedation?
Sedation, yes. Right.
Yeah, coffee. Well, one is you're looking more for boosters, and the other one you're looking for relaxers or hypnotics, whatever they call them.
Mostly people will naturally either prefer to be relaxing, or they'll be looking around for something to do. Okay. So you can recognise these three types. Another person, the person who fantasises, right? This person generally really does have their head out quite a bit in front of their body, quite a bit actually. This enables them to be able to hallucinate.
Oh, good.
And actually, somebody who is asking questions in life quite a bit, asking a lot of questions in life, generally this person's body, becomes in the shape of a question mark quite a bit. That the head comes out in front of the body, and it's kind of really, the person's really kind of shaped like a question mark actually. But anyway, you can know that whenever you ask a question, you are starting to live what the answer is to that question. So it's a good idea to be asking questions that are questions that you want to be living the answer to, because you'll start living the answer to the question once you ask the question.
Why is that?
Because our words have physiology.
Why is that question?
Okay, actually, if you ask as you were asking, you have asked the question, and you ask the question again in your mind, you will notice actually that you are living it. You are living this question. You are starting to live the question. So it's a good idea for us to make sure that we're asking questions that we want to live the answer to.
Like, what is the solution?
Because the mind is more like a computer.
Oh, I see.
You never press into a computer, don't access this file. Don't do that.
Okay, that's a statement. A question would be
a
question would be something like,
What time is it?
why does it seem that I'm dumb? Okay. Or why is it that I seem, what is it, why am I this way? These questions are not getting anywhere.
What can I do to feel really intelligent?
Yes. This is a question that I can be living. I'm living those other questions too.
You can
This
ask
is a question I would prefer to live though. People who get ahead in life really they've learned to ask the right questions.
Well, the question has an answer in it. The question has the answer in the question. So if you ask the right question, you
Give us an example.
just what Richard just said. That was what made me think of it.
What can I do to feel more
What
intelligent?
can I do to feel more intelligent?
Feel more
Feel more intelligent. It starts to arrive. The answer starts to appear because you've asked the question.
You're programming yourself to feel intelligent.
Yeah, feel intelligent. There's the answer. Oh, feel intelligent. There it is. And then things begin to come out on the screen about what feel intelligent would be. Open your eyes, listen, be aware.
Dave?
Is there any specific criteria for asking, enabling, and empowering a question?
Yes. What, when, who, when. Who, what, when, this will always relate to something, actually specific. Something that we can experience. Yeah. But a question like why am I this way? Why is just absolving self from, like trying to figure out, what is like bringing it back to something sensory specific? Or when does this happen? Or how does this happen? Or who specifically is this about?
Yeah.
So I talked a little about, I think I shared a little bit about when we would go back, say, 7,000 years, did I?
7 million?
So we're out of the water now.
Yes, we're out of the water. And Australopithecus has been walking the land.
Tell us where the three groups went again.
One went to China, the gracile features. The other went to become the Negroid race, and the other, most of us are Neanderthal, quite a bit. Kind of went north, more or less.
Now this is before fire. This is well before fire, or is it has any kind of family or bonding started occurring in small groups yet?
Oh yes, families.
How about in the water?
Oh yes.
Okay.
Oh, actually, we slowly lost all of our body hair, and the only hair that kind of seemed to be useful was hair on the head, and it's thought that the child has, the only thing the child has, it's very landlocked, the child is, it can float. It can really float, the child can float as soon as it's born, and it also has a grasping reflex. And so it's thought that the hair was what the child would grasp to, whilst the mother was, or the father was
still do that.
was working in the wading in the waters, swimming in the waters, and that was what the children held the hair.
What about when, like, the head's up out of the water to protect it from the sun? The head from the sun?
Possibly too, yeah. Yes, possibly as well. Right.
There's Aboriginal cultures in Australia that still live really close to the earth, and they live with a few pods that live really close to the sea, still swim with their children. The babies hold on to the mother's hair, and she gathers shellfish and swims back.
Right, yes.
When is speech coming in?
Speech starts to become important during this period of time because the major way that I communicate in the water, like when we're swimming, truly is with the auditory self, making auditory sounds, much like all of the animals, the mammals, that have shifted back into the sea do today, communicating with each other.
Would the Clan of Cave Bear series, are you familiar?
Yeah.
Would that fit in with this evolution that you're describing?
Actually, in the Clan of the Cave Bear, there's probably remnants of see now, not all of people are walking upright in Clan of the Cave Bear.
Cave bear was taken about 30,000 years ago.
Quite, yeah, it's about 30,000 years ago.
Recently, this is like millions going back to 3.7 over. Yeah, that trail.
All of the people, I think, in Clan of the Cave Bear are walking upright.
Yeah.
Some of the more newly developed features, like the larger frontal.
Some Neanderthals, some Cro-Magnon.
Right.
At that time,
They
we
were
were switching
new
back.
prototypes.
Let's have a look at everybody's teeth. Gracile teeth and Neanderthal features. Gracile teeth and Neanderthal features.
What's gracile about her teeth?
That's shovel-shaped teeth. Shovel-shaped teeth. Gracile teeth, Neanderthal features. Gracile, however, just a tiny little bit of Neanderthal, but mostly gracile teeth, Neanderthal teeth. Annie's also got gracile teeth. Let's just have a quick look at teeth.
Oh my God!
Ned and I have Neanderthal teeth.
Now what's that?
What makes them that?
Where?
He has square teeth,
Smaller teeth, right?
and that's the teeth are a little bit smaller. Okay.
That's small teeth, baby.
But act relatively.
Yeah, that's very good.
Gracile relatively, but a little bit of Neanderthal too. Just a tiny bit.
Into your head.
Very subtle.
Gracile.
Let's see those teeth there.
Gracile teeth. Gracile teeth. Gracile teeth. Gracile teeth. All right. Ned and I have Neanderthal teeth.
Gee, what does that mean?
So you see, Ned is the most Neanderthal out of all of us. Ned is the most Neanderthal here. The schnauzer and the teeth and everything is really, and the body hair a little bit is quite Neanderthal. Okay. They're more square. Right, yeah.
Terry's teeth kind of square?
Huh?
And I have a little...
She has a tiny, but actually there's a little bit of wear there. Mostly though, it's kind of gracile, but there's a little bit of Neanderthal. There's always a bit of a mixture maybe. But actually most people who have really shovel-shaped teeth, you have gracile teeth and anyway...
So Eskimos would be gracile.
there's mixtures of there too.
From the Oriental.
Yes.
They come so hairless, basically.
Right.
And they use their teeth very much like you're talking about. The women who gnaw on their moccasins to get them soft to put them on stuff.
Yes, right, yes.
This is coming from the Neanderthal.
No, gracile. Oh, excuse me.
I ordered that book that Gene Houston has, that little story about the Neanderthals. I'll see if I can find it today and read it.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're out of the water.
Okay, so 7,000 years ago, I'm sure I shared this, but I'll just finish it anyway.
We're 7,000 years ago?
Yes, we'll go to about 7,000 years ago. About 100,000 years ago, we started to have fire, and we really started to live more somewhat as you're imagining things today. The Tasmanian Aboriginals, if you could go back 40,000 years in civilization, you would arrive at where the Tasmanian Aboriginals were today, if there were any Tasmanian Aboriginals alive.
What they look like?
They were the most isolated peoples of the New World. They have been isolated for some 40,000 years. And it was like landing on a Paleolithic shore. With their mentality, their understanding, their language, the things that were available to them in the way they used their senses. They had the most phenomenal ability to use the vestibular system and direction intensely. They could foretell climatic conditions from the change of the winds, and they had many, many vestibular predicates in their language. Many, many vestibular predicates in their language.
And they're the predecessors of what people now?
Most of them are all died out. There are some remnants of the Tasmanian Aboriginal, around Tasmania, but mostly they all died out. By the early 1800s, they'd all died.
Were they studied in this recording?
Not much at all. Little. Very little.
Stories with you about when you're buried on the island.
Oh.
I love that story. They were so unusual because they really were like a prehistoric man that they got, I think it was like a flu or something that kind of wiped them all out. And so collectors wanted to bring the bodies or the bones, skeletal structures back to museums. And so they'd take the graves, which was a kind of missing taboo of the people. They definitely wanted their people to be buried in Tasmania. So
we buried, many of them were buried on our island.
Yes.
In Tasmania.
To protect them from
to protect them from being dug up and taken to, England and other places.
Stand on boats and talk to you, but they won't get on the island.
Let's go back 7,000 years. 7,000 years ago, we were living. We were still a little bit quite stimulus signal bound, much like animals are communicating with each other today. Through kind of how we communicate actually by what we do with our body. And in the oldest languages and the stories that we have today, things that ordinarily were interpreted as the mind, like for instance the thamos, the linguists interpret this thamos as meaning the mind, because in the story it would be so-and-so's thamos spoke to them. Thamos is just a word. Thamos. Thamos. And thamos was interpreted by the linguists as being mind. But I tell you, thamos meant heart. Phrenes was another word which was interpreted as the mind, but phrenes was the lungs. And people's hands spoke to them. People were much more not so having an integrated concept of I yet. They were more sensing that they were being controlled. And it was more like this hemisphere that would be involved in making decisions, and was mostly rote learned, what they had rote learned. And so in this era, of course, people could throw some sticks up in the air, and the way they would land, they would know the significance of something. Or they would just simply look up into the clouds and see the shape of something, and they would know the significance of something to come. So these things were acting like triggers, enabling the person to intuit what it is that they were needing to know. And 7,000 years ago, there were pockets of people. The largest pocket of people that we have evidence of is about 100 people in a village. This is like the largest kind of village that we've sensed. And so some land sunk beneath the sea between Crete and Turkey, where this plateau of land sunk. And when it sunk beneath the sea, it sent a huge wall of water over the land. And this was quite an intense natural calamity that occurred. And before this time, people were really quite isolated from each other, quite incredibly, not having very much contact at all. Not as much as all of a sudden started to occur as a result of this calamity. When this calamity occurred, people started scurrying into each other. And what our idea was about making decisions was different possibly to this other tribe's way of making decisions. And the only way they could explain how somebody who was dead, like a chief or someone who was dead, how this person's voice, they could still hear this person's voice in their head. The only explanation of this was that this was a god. So when people started, of course, also to, they would have handheld idols, many handheld idols during this period of time. They would hold a handheld idol up in their hand and look at the two eyes and hallucinate what they needed to know. This would help them go into trance to know what it was that they needed to know. Or they would go underneath a statue of God to understand something that was to come. So all of the words that we have originally come from doing words. They come from verbs. All of the words.
David, when they stood under the statue of a god to understand what they need to know,
Understand.
I understand, I know that, but what was their experience? They thought that if something was above them, I thought about that, and it's like...
Well, the stars in the sky mystically have always represented a place of transformation. Blue as a symbol of colour is a symbol of transformation. Most people had the belief that, well, it seems like the earth was what produced us, and then when we left, it seemed that we possibly went to the gods. We have always tried to build higher and higher and higher and higher structures up during this period of time, because the higher that we would go up, people thought the closer they got to God. People knew about the Himalayas in this time. People had been travelling to the Himalayas for many hundreds of years, thousands of years. They knew about the highest place in the world, in the land, and people went there to receive things from God, and people went there who were enlightened. And this is where language really first starts to be written down, our first language. But anyway, our first language, of course, before this time, the way that information was passed on, well, it was passed on through story. And it's much more difficult to turn your hearing off. When there was a pharaoh in Egypt, who started to count things that were being traded, as people were trading things at this point, starting to trade. This was the first time that the visual system started to be used as a language. And it wasn't long after this that the first laws of the land were written on a post. And people could decide, once this happened, people could decide not to look at that if they didn't want to, and the concept of I started to form. Where I start to sense my own autonomy apart from what it is that's I'm led to believe. And this even creates more disparity, actually. Because before, when things were just completely rote learned, everything was just like smooth, all of a sudden now here comes a time where people are starting to sense their own autonomy. And so 2,000 years ago, prophets were walking around on the earth, and they were sharing with everyone that God was in each person. And this this idea that God was external, was something outside the person, was antiquated. However, this was kind of quite a blasphemous thing to say, that God was in each person, because the emperors in this, they were the representatives of God. They wanted you to believe they were God. And so it was quite a blasphemous thing for people to be walking around saying that God was in each person. Palm Sunday was the holiest day of the year for the Jews. And I just finished with this story. This story was passed down to me. And it comes from records kept during this era from the Romans. And it also comes from records kept in the East. Palm Sunday, as I said, was the most holiest day for the Jews. During this period of time, Pontius Pilate and Rome was ruling Jerusalem. And their empire, and the Romans were ruling with a bloody sword. They were extremely barbaric. And when Jesus was walking around, as other prophets were, Jesus was asking the people, how could they have forgotten their covenant with their God? How could they allow the Romans to be in this position, ruling with a bloody sword? And that Jesus was preaching love and preaching this idea that God was in each person. The Jews really didn't have anyone that was a voice for them. Mostly they were run all over the place. And the monetary system of the world really was not working then. There was great disparity and unequalness in the way the monetary system was set up. Thousands of Jews would flock to Jerusalem for Palm Sunday. And Pontius Pilate was ruling Jerusalem with only 500 centuries. So this was a kind of a nervous time for the Romans, because they realised they were just keeping order by killing, basically, and ruling with a bloody sword. And so every now and then the people would set up some civil disobedience. And Jesus and his followers decided that they would set up some things that would be protesting. They are much like people like you and I. 2,000 years ago is not very long ago at all. So they decided that they would go down and into the temples that ordinarily were there for worshipping, where the money was being exchanged, and they would kind of disrupt everything down there. They planned this some days before Palm Sunday. And so everybody had heard about Jesus. Many people had heard him speak, because he would just speak to throngs of people where he was. And so this day they decided to go down into the temples to kind of create a little civil disobedience. And Palm Sunday was coming up some days ahead, and many people had flocked to Jerusalem, as I said. And the disciples, and it was meant to be something that was just small, that when people heard this is what they were going to do, everybody rallied, and there was a frenzy started to develop. Everybody thought, here's somebody stepping forward. There would be a voice for us. And the Old Testament was already written at this time, and true to the scriptures that were written. People put Jesus on an ass because that was written already. True to the scriptures, when they saw Jesus on an ass, they started laying palm leaves down in front of the ass And people started to throng because they thought that here was a way for them to be free, and that here was a man that was stepping forward to be a voice for them. By the time they got down to the temples, there was many people involved, and they created quite a bit of havoc. They turned the tables over and upset everything. But Pontius Pilate panicked and sent those 500 centuries into this region, and they just were killing people indiscriminately. I think if the Jews had stood their ground, the Romans would completely have been overwhelmed, because there were thousands and thousands of Jews and only 500 centuries. But when people saw the Roman centuries coming, just killing people, they panicked and fled and ran from this area. And the Romans captured some of these people, and that there was some battling a little, but not much. Mostly the people fled. And they fled up into the hills out of Jerusalem. And that evening, some dreadful news arrived. Something that no one had expected at all. Everybody thought that this would simply be civil disobedience, that's all. And it had turned out to be something like a monster. The news arrived with Judas that Jesus' son had been captured by Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate gave Judas a message that the Son of God would be crucified unless Jesus turned himself in. So this really was a shock and quite a degree of sadness and wondering what to do. They knew it was possible to survive a crucifixion. It was not uncommon to survive a crucifixion. And Jesus knew that he would turn himself in for his son's life. But Pontius Pilate was looking at Jesus as he was being God, because that's what he was saying. That's what Pontius Pilate was, how Pontius Pilate interpreted it. So Jesus met with his disciples, and they came up with a plan. That they knew that it was possible to survive a crucifixion. They also knew that no Jew would be left hanging on the cross on Palm Sunday. The Jews would not tolerate that. This was the holiest day of the year, and anybody who was left hanging on the cross, the minute that the day broke, the new day broke, they could bring this person down. So Jesus knew that he had 48 hours in which to turn himself in, and that if everything went according to plan, it was possible that he could survive the crucifixion. Pontius Pilate had to be very careful in the way that he dealt with this situation, because it was potentially explosive. So Jesus walks into Jerusalem, and he is right close to the garrison in a garden the last night after the supper. And Judas was the one one of Jesus' best friends, who was the one who would go and bring the centuries, note the centuries, and let them know where he was. And anyway, so some of this story, most of you know. The Romans also had a policy that when a holy day would be coming up, if there was some prisoner that was up for execution, they would turn this person over to the people, and they would ask the people to choose whether there would be someone they would let go. And that morning when, after Jesus' trial, Jesus was brought out in front of all the people. And this enabled Pontius Pilate's decision to crucify him to be more legitimate, because the people that turned up for that meeting mostly were the money lenders, and they all shouted that Jesus should be crucified. So these sages of the ages knew of the use of substances to create altered states of awareness. And lysergic acid was something that they used in those days that came from the mildew, the mould of wheat. They knew that if they could put this substance into the blood, directly into the blood, that this would mimic death. And this substance was put on the end of the spear that lanced Jesus' side, his ribs, that put this substance into his blood. So for all intensive purposes, anybody looking at Jesus would sense that he was dead. It was also known that Palm Sunday started not at 12 midnight, but when the sun set the day before. It was possible to bribe the centuries also, so that the family would be spared the ridicule of having a member of their family up in this situation publicly. And so the families, they could bribe the centuries. For all intensive purposes, it looked like Jesus was dead, and that the centuries allowed his body to be taken to this tomb. This information comes from texts that were written that have just been discovered in the last 15 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Jesus lived his life in Bethany, and he lived until he was 80 years of age. He lived as an outcast. He still healed the sick and visited people and spoke, but mostly he lived as an outcast. Bethany was like a stronghold. It was like a garrison fort outside Jerusalem. It was the only place where the outcasts more or less could be. That was a strong place, and the Romans allowed this to be. And some 40 years later, they levelled this city. And levelled everybody that was in this city. So I share this story because there's an evolution of our consciousness in this story, of the conscious development of self. And just as 2,000 years ago, prophets were walking around the earth saying that God was in each person, and that this was an expansion in our consciousness as it is that we are today. The language of peace and what creates whole brain functioning is also a development of consciousness. No longer, hopefully, are people going to be voting for politicians who are speaking about what they don't want, or speaking about what they don't believe, or focusing on what the limitations are. Because you can know this person's only using less than a third of their brain, and that we need people to lead us who are using all their brain, that are framing things positively, that are focused on the resources of how that we can get this, that are focused on the outcome of what it is that we want. I'll just play a tiny little bit of flute and then we'll make a small break and then we'll come back to talk a little bit about the meta model and rapport and some other things.